Now, Ms. Flint, just before I formally welcome you to the inquiry, I think Ms. Fraser-Butlin has something more to add to something we've been looking at this week, which is the destruction of documents.
Thank you, sir. Before we start today, I wanted to simply highlight the references for some witness statements we've received and some other work that the inquiry team has done in relation to document destruction. I wanted to highlight a set of 7 witness statements, just so that people were aware that they were available addressing this issue. There is a statement from Yvonne de Sampaio, the Senior Personal Secretary to Dr Metters, who was himself Deputy CMO and Chair of the ACVSB, and that is at WITN 7914001. There is a statement from David Burridge, who is a Higher Executive Officer. The URN, the reference for that is WITN 7149001. Dr Patricia Troop, Deputy CMO, is the successor of Dr Metters, WITN 7169001. John Rutherford, a Higher Executive Officer, the reference for that is WITN 7224001. And a statement from Lawrence George, a former internal auditor, WITN 6963001. The reason to flag the statements is that they've cropped up during the week and we've been requested just to make it clear where those are available. In addition, there are 2 further statements. Lorraine Jackson, Director of Information Risk Management and Assurance at the Department of Health and Social Care, WITN 7193001, and a joint statement by her and William Vinall, Director of NHS Quality, Safety and Investigations at the DHSC. And those 2 final witness statements deal with the second element that I wanted to highlight. And that is that over a number of months, the inquiry team has sought to reconstruct the documents that made up the ACVSB papers. That's the GEB files that we've been discussing, and also the HIV litigation public interest immunity papers. The team have produced schedules setting out the understanding of what the papers were and references on relativity on the database for the documents that we have been able to identify. And I want to give, if I may, the codes for those schedules so that others can look at them. In relation to the ACVSB files, the reference is INQY 40380. And in relation to the public interest immunity documents, the reference is INQY 40379. It doesn't mean that work on these schedules is complete. The team continues to look, but they are in such a position that we think it's helpful that core participants can access them.
So is the upshot of that the inquiry team has not yet found all the documents that we know were destroyed or mislaid or disappeared, whatever it may be?
That's correct. Where a reference on relativity is available, that's provided, but it is not complete. There are documents that we've been unable to track, but the majority have been found.
Yes. For those who've been listening, there are an awful lot of numbers there. They may not pick that up immediately, but of course what you have just said will be published. It will be on the inquiry website, as indeed all the transcripts of proceedings are, and anyone who wants to find those numbers needs just go to the start of today, Friday the 16th of September 2022, and look at your opening words, and they will see all those references set out.
Yes.
Thank you. Forgive me for that introduction. It has no bearing directly on your evidence. Can I just explain the arrangements for you? You're facing an audience which is a mixture of the public and core participants and participants. And beyond this room, there's another where people will be watching on large screens in this building. But beyond this room, there will be around about a three-figure number of people who throughout the day will be watching on either YouTube or live stream to listen and hear what you have to say. Miss Fraser-Butlin will ask you the questions. Those behind her and to your left are lawyers. At the back of the room, there is at least one representative of the press, and there may be others during the day. Now, in a moment or two, I'm going to ask Ellie to invite you to take the oath, and then we can begin with the questions. Ellie.
Please state your full name.
Caroline Louise Flint.
Please take the book in your raised hand and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and
nothing but the truth.
nothing but the truth. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, sir. Ms Flint, you provided a witness statement to the inquiry, and I understand that there is one sentence that you want to amend. If we could put that immediately up on the screen, WITN 5427001, please. And if we turn to page 173. It's paragraph 3.249, which starts at the bottom of this page and carries on over the page. We can turn to the next page. Addressing a particular submission, and then there is the sentence, a draft letter for Hugh Taylor to approve was annexed, but I have not seen a copy of it. I understand that that needs to be removed from your statement. Is that right?
Yes.
Ms Flint, I want to start then with a brief overview of your career. You initially worked in public authority roles, including as the London Borough of Lambeth Senior Equalities and Staff Development Principal Officer. Is that right?
Correct.
And you became a Member of Parliament in May 1997?
Correct.
And worked in various positions, including Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Home Affairs between June 2003 and May 2005?
Yes.
And then from the 10th of May 2005 to the 5th of May 2006, you were Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Public Health.
Yes.
And then Minister of State for Public Health from the 5th of May 2006 to the 28th of June 2007.
Yes.
And you then went on to other roles in government and in opposition.
Correct.
You moved throughout your time as a minister between roles every year or every 2 years. And that's something we've heard from a number of other witnesses as well. Do you have any reflections on the impact of that churn, as it's been called, on policy making?
I think it does have an impact. In some ways, looking back, the period, 2 years that I spent at the Home Office and 2 years in the Department of Health were the longest periods, and it did mean that some subjects I could see from start to completion. When you're entering a department, obviously you've got to get up to speed. It can be a completely different portfolio to the one you've had before. It may not be something in terms of your own personal work experience you have got any particular knowledge or experience of. So there's a huge amount of absorbing information, taking on decisions that have been made before, but also activities that have been made before. So I do think that the churn of ministers in government from one department to another is not helpful.
And this was your first role in the health department. Do you know how you came to be chosen for the role?
No.
Did you have any background or context in relation to the health department that was seen as particularly of assistance?
Nope.
You've said in your statement that your portfolio as Parliamentary Under-Secretary was the same or very similar to when you were Minister of State. Can you tell us broadly what was within your portfolio?
So I covered the public health portfolio, and that would include all those issues around smoking, alcohol, diet, exercise, health inequalities, and so the full range of those areas. I also dealt with drugs and alcohol in terms of addictions. That was something that I covered when I was at the Home Office, so it was one of the areas that I had some experience of before and continued to work with the Home Office on that issue. I also covered contraceptives, fertility, the Health Protection Agency, and a whole number of other things that I put in my statement, and bodies that I work with as well, external bodies too. And of course, in relation to the proceedings today, I also covered blood donor services, but also the issues around the Alliance health organisations and those who were infected by blood products and their families who were affected by it.
When you started the role in the Department of Health, what sort of briefing did you receive?
I can't remember exactly, but the usual thing was that you would have a series of different department heads and members of staff coming to see you, giving you maybe a written note, but also some oral briefing. And usually it would be a sort of heads up, really, about the areas of policy. As soon as you start in department, you actually have to start work. So if Parliament is expecting you to go and answer questions on day 2 of being in the department, you have to go and do it. So, there's not a huge amount of time to have an induction in the way others might see it in their own workplaces. You have to hit the ground running and then find the time where you can. But the first few weeks as much as possible, and you would also inherit the previous minister's diary and often be asked, do you want to do that or not? Obviously if it was something they'd been in for a long time, I would have tried to do that. But essentially that's what it's like. And then of course, as you go on, you consistently get the briefings. Again, you can ask more questions. Obviously you do things, you have letters from MPs and other parliamentarians in the House of Lords, and that triggers also more conversations. But there's not a sort of structured programme per se in terms of what you do. In your private office, in health, my private office, they had designated roles covering different areas of my portfolio, and they would be key people, obviously, who you would be able to informally ask about things and where something had come from, what was happening, what was coming up. Essentially, I suppose the most important thing was to be aware of, in the different policy areas you covered, what projects were underway, what legislation might be coming forward, what were the sort of headline issues that you might face in the next few months.
Now, can I ask you just to slow down a little?
Sorry.
No, it's nothing to apologise for. It's just the stenographer has to keep up. And you were speaking just a little quickly.
Noted, Sir Brian. I'll try my best.
I want to start off with you discussing some of the issues around the trusts and schemes providing financial assistance. In 2002, the spending review outcome for the Mcfarland Trust was a commitment to a 3-year package of capital funding. And you've set out in your statement that they received £3 million in 2003-04, £3 million in 2004-05, and £3.05 million in 2005-06. A business case was then submitted for capital funding from 2006-07, and it's that I wanted to talk with you a little bit about. Could we turn to the business case, please? MACF 40177_017. It's dated November 2005, and then if we go over the page, we have the introduction, and we have the third paragraph. This business case highlights the evidence for re-evaluating earlier assumptions about the funding needs of long-term survivors now coping with prolonged ill health, unremitting personal and social stress, strained family relationships, erosion of capital and savings, falling standard of living, susceptibility to the poverty, benefit, credit traps, burgeoning debt and other financial disadvantage. And the business case goes on to set out the projected requirements for the trust. If we go over the page, we see that there's a revised estimated need of £7.25 million annually. And in bold at the end of the page, we see this: to fulfil their quasi-agency role in a way that, while doing credit to the Department of Health, properly meets the needs of registrants and their families, MFT's trustees recommend that the rate of departmental funding should rise to £7 million annually for 5 years from April 2006, index-linked to Her Majesty Government's preferred annual cost of living indicator. And in a covering letter dated the 24th of November 2005, Peter Stevens asked to meet with you. When you came into your post, what awareness and understanding did you have of what the Mcfarland Trust had been set up to do?
My understanding was that the Mcfarland Trust was set up to provide financial support granted by monies from government to support those infected because of blood products, but also some affected by it as well, their families. And that involved, there was a mixture of issues around lump sum payments that came from the department, but also it provided support in different ways with day-to-day needs that registrants needed support with. My understanding when I came in was that it had been agreed before I became minister, I think in January, earlier that year, definitely in 2005, that they were going to do a revised business case, and that was work in progress.
And when this business case arrived with a revised figure of 7.25 million, was that something that your officials spoke to you about straight away?
I didn't actually get to see that until I think it was January. It hadn't come into my office. I think it might have gone into other parts of DH.
We'll look at that correspondence in a moment, but in November 2005, December 2005, did your officials raise the point that a business case had come in for a very substantial sum?
Not as far as I can remember. Up until that point, I had been told that actually there was a discussion between officials and those from Mcfarland Trust that actually money was going to be difficult and there was likely to not necessarily be an increase.
If we turn then to DHSC 6278301, please. It's an email string, so we need to start on page 2.
Could you make it a little bit bigger, please? Sorry. Thank you.
The bottom email, 16th of January 2006. Please find attached a scanned copy of the letter addressed to Caroline Flint from Peter Stevens, dated the 24th of November 2005, which was the covering letter with the report. And then if we go up to the top, Jennifer Mason has messaged Jackie. Brian Bradley from the Health Protection team rang today to ask Michelle about the attached correspondence. It was copied to officials, but I can't find any records of our having received it. And then there's a note: the Mcfarland Trust supports those made ill by the use of contaminated blood products in medical treatment. Have you seen this letter before? And if we go back to page 1, please. We see the response from your private office. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. This is the first I've seen of it, and I have not been able to find any record on this on our meeting request database. And there's a request for advice and a draft reply. Do you have any understanding of why the letter and the business case did not reach your office until the January?
No.
Does it surprise you that a business case that had, as you say, been in preparation since January 2005 didn't reach you more promptly?
Well, yes. I mean, I think, I would have hoped it would have come through the system quicker. But I can't speculate on why that didn't happen and where it was in the other parts of DH when it came in. But I wasn't aware of it.
Was this something that was unusual for something that didn't reach you too quickly, or was it something that unfortunately happened regularly?
I wouldn't say it was regular, but I have had experience as a minister of information coming in and not coming directly or in what would be, I would suggest, good time to my office as a minister, not necessarily in the Department of Health, but in other departments as well. Hence, I apologise to Mr. Stevens.
We see that in your letter of reply, DHSC 0041198_159, please. And it's dated the 26th of January 2006, and we'll pick up the third and fourth paragraphs, please. We have not yet set budget figures for any departmental budgets for next year, as priorities for all departmental programmes are currently being reassessed. The Secretary of State has said that all of the department's central budgets should be looked at to ensure they give value for money. We'll be in touch with you again when this process is completed. I understand that you're approaching the end of your term as chair of the Mcfarland Trust, and I'd like to thank you for your work on behalf of the Trust. The department is indebted to individuals such as yourself who contribute to our work. I would, of course, be pleased to meet with you, but I suggest that it would be the best approach if I met you together with the incoming chair when your replacement has been identified, to welcome him or her to the position and to discuss the forward work of the Trust over the next year. It seems that the optimum timing for this meeting could be in April or May, which would also fit with the annual reporting and accounts cycle. And there is a note that those arrangements would be made by your office. Can you help us with why April or May would be optimal in terms of the financial reporting and accounts cycle?
I believe it because there was obviously active discussions about what was going in terms of the central budget for the department. There clearly had been discussions that I can remember before this date that things were going to be tight. I think they thought that actually some of the clarity of what would be possible would be clearer by then. But in terms of the sort of discussions and between on different sections of Department of Health and their budgets, that wasn't something I was party to. That was led at official level.
Just to help us understand how the financial reporting cycles happened, in April and May, had decisions been made, would decisions have been made about what was available? Or when, between, say, April and August, were decisions becoming more entrenched?
Sorry, could you repeat that again? Sorry.
Of course. Between the April and, say, August, at what point over those months did decisions start to become rather more entrenched on financial matters?
I think they probably were, I think essentially the framework in terms of how much the department had to deal with was known. How that was going to be divided up from the different demands from different parts of the Department of Health was an ongoing discussion, I think, between officials representing those different areas. My sense is, and this is just my sense, that there would be quite a lot of discussions about where certain monies could come from, and often until things are cleared, it often wasn't, necessarily as clear as it might be about what opportunities there were to get extra money and where from. It was a complicated process from what I understand, which as a minister you had not much to do with. It was really dealt with by senior people in the department, and that's all I can really recall.
Would it be fair that the further on from April and May in a year that you got, the harder it would be for monies to be found for different things and for it to be shifted around?
I really don't know the answer to that. I think there was a lot of uncertainty about just how the budgets were going to look, what demands were, and what, if you like, what priorities there were within that for the Department of Health. And there seemed to be a lot of back and forth going on during this period. What I was aware of before, obviously, Christmas, was the budgets that my portfolio oversaw were going to be tight, and that included in this area as well. And hence, as I said earlier, I was already getting indications before Christmas that officials had discussions with people from the Trust about that situation.
But as a minister, if you said in April, May, I want to prioritise this and have a significant injection of cash here, was that more doable than if you had said that in July, August?
The previous year?
No, following the same year.
Look, I think the budgets were tight, and there was discussions going on about what we could get from that.
Stepping away from the budgets of that particular year, more generally, if in April, May of a particular year you said as the Minister, I want an injection of cash there, was that more doable than saying it 3 or 4 months later?
I think by April, May, it was clear to me that there was not going to be much money available, and therefore, you know, in July, August, yes, it was pretty clear that there wasn't much more that we could do.
Could we turn then to DHSC 5011528, please? This is an email between officials in May 2006, which I understand that you, it was discussing, let me start that again, apologies. The email is dated 17th of May 2006. We discussed briefly yesterday the options for utilising the funding for the MFT that we hope is about to be agreed. The full amount is considerably more than we could justify, and indeed than they expect. But we could put some £10 million of this to good effect as a single payment, if Gerard is content to go that far. This would amount to less than half what they're asking for, and would leave approximately £6 million in the budget after the recurrent funding for this year. And then it would be helpful to have this ready to go up very soon after the budgets are agreed, so response in the next day or two would be appreciated. We can see from the heading of the email that this was about a draft submission that was to go up. This wasn't something you were aware of at the time, is that right?
I don't think I was aware of it at the time, no.
We then have an email from the 8th of June, DHSC 6340820. Gerard, you may be interested to note the present state of play with our thinking on this submission. Jonathan and I have been redrafting this over the last couple of days and feel that the £400,000 is reasonable, but would be grateful for your confirmation, or otherwise, that it is affordable in the current budget planning. It is, of course, much less than they are asking for, and it may be helpful for MSPH to have some negotiating room on this figure if this is possible. You may be interested to note that we now have 2 registrants inquiring about their legal status with regards to a waiver they've signed before registering with the MFT, agreeing not to sue the government. Both we and the MFT are having problems finding copies of these waivers. Do you have any knowledge of what had changed between the 17th of May and the 8th of June, such that the figure had dropped from 10 million to £400,000?
No, I can't recall that.
And were you aware at the time of any of these discussions about the figures that would be proposed?
No, I can't recall. All I'm aware of is that there were obviously officials working to see what they could get in terms of the discussions across the department in terms of the sums of money for the trust.
There's a reference here to there being some negotiating room, if this is possible. What was meant by that?
I don't know. It was never presented to me as a negotiating room. Did you have any idea that you would be negotiating on a figure with the MFT? No. I'm sure you're going to come to it in your questions, but the submissions that then came to me were pretty clear in terms of the options.
If we turn to that submission, it's dated the 14th of June 2006 at DHSC 5026 at 530. And we see that it's dated the 14th of June 2006. And under timing, we see urgent. This financial year is well underway and Central Finance are on the point of confirming the available budget levels for this year. Can you help us with why this was provided in June 2006 at a point when it had become urgent?
I think part of it was us trying to, having got the business case in from the Mcfarland Trust, and obviously it was substantially higher than what we were able to offer them, or what I was able to offer them later on in the year, to try and do some more work about what we could have access to in terms of monies, and it was a delay. And I don't think it necessarily helped the conversations that we were going to have. I can't really say any more than that. I think there was quite a lot of work just going on to try and find some money for the Mcfarland Trust.
You had obviously responded to Peter Stevens offering a meeting in April and May.
Yeah.
When you received this briefing in June, did you raise any concerns about the fact that here we were in June and you hadn't met with him and you were having the submission only presented to you at that point in time?
I think I had concerns from when I was aware of the business case and what was being asked for, and knowing that that wasn't something that was going to be able to be met within the department, and therefore I was concerned about what options were open to us. I can't remember exactly why we didn't meet in April, May. I did actually, when this meeting was set for July, try to get that earlier, not by a significant amount, I know, but to try and get that earlier, and that was offered to the Mcfarland Trust, but for different reasons it was kept to the later meeting in July.
So you've said you had concerns from the January and now we're in June. What involvement did you have in the process then between January and June?
My involvement in the process was, officials were tasked with coming back to any of options in terms of monies we could provide for the Mcfarland Trust, and basically discussions ongoing around that, and that they would come back to me, having obviously this was a cross-departmental conversation as to what was available and what was recommended by those working in the Blood Policy Division.
But I think, and please correct me if I've misunderstood your evidence, I think your evidence earlier was that you weren't involved in any of those discussions yourself.
No, not directly, no. But obviously I was aware that there was discussions going on about what could be found, and that I was waiting on a submission and clarity from officials.
If we then look at the submission, pick it up at paragraph 6 at the bottom of this page. The chair of the Mcfarland Trust, Peter Stevens, wrote to MSPH in November 2005, making a case for increasing the funding of the MFT to £7 million per year for the next 5 years, and for doubling the funding of the ET, the Eileen Trust. This case is based on the position that the surviving registrants are living longer than was expected in the original settlement, and they have a significant life expectation. Their living costs and needs are therefore substantially different and greater. Many of them, however, have very little prospect of earning a realistic income, and they and their families are dependent on a combination of welfare benefits and this income. And then further down we have the heading Argument, and options effectively are put to you. First of all, the option of outright refusal of this case and flat cash funding may be justified on the grounds that payments to the relatively small number of surviving registrants have increased substantially in the last 5 years, as the level of funding has not declined in parallel with the decline in registrant numbers. Paragraph 10, it could also be argued that the Department of Health should not be bearing the full financial responsibility for these registrants and their families, as there are several other public services whose functions include supporting these unfortunate people. And then the next page, on paragraph 12, there is an option of full acceptance of this claim. It seems neither affordable nor justifiable. It would more than double the average level of benefit per registrant, all else being equal, which could be considered excessive. It would be difficult to defend complete acceptance of a case for increased expenditure in some of the questionable areas noted above, without rigorous questioning and assessment against other spending priorities. And then paragraph 13, a partial acceptance of this claim might, however, be justifiable, as it would indicate that the department is indeed able and willing to renew its commitment to supporting those infected by contaminated blood products while living within our reasonable resource limits. And the conclusion, on balance, we feel that the justification for an increase is not strong. There is, however, a lot of pressure from the Trust and registrants, and MSPH could consider increasing the funding for the Mcfarland and Eileen Trusts by £400,000, £350,000 for the MFT and £50,000 for the ET. The split could be adjusted on the advice of the chairman. Obviously, in your briefing, there is no reference to the larger sum that was initially discussed. Do you remember in any oral discussions whether there was that larger sum was ever raised with you?
I think from what I recall that the larger sum was just seen as not affordable at all in terms of what could be provided from by the department.
Was it ever indicated to you as something that had been discussed?
By whom? Did
the officials ever say to you, we've previously discussed this sum, but it's not affordable?
I think that I was indicated to me in different ways that actually that was not an amount that was going to be able to be found within the budget.
So at some point you think you were told that they had been discussing a bigger sum than the £400,000?
Oh, no, I don't know, sorry, I misunderstood your question there. The amount in terms of the bid from the trust was never sort of in terms of having a discussion about could we find that. I think it was just seen as that there was not money available for that sort of increase, and therefore the focus was on what could be provided.
So on the one hand you had the business case requesting £7 million, and here you have a partial acceptance with £400,000. Was there ever any discussion about providing a sum in between those two figures?
No.
Can you help us with what you understood by the phrase, on balance, we feel that the justification for an increase is not strong?
I think the recommendation from the blood policy officials was that actually that there shouldn't be an increase.
Why not?
Because for different reasons they felt that the money's available, supplied for what they thought were the needs, and I think you'd probably have to ask officials more about that. That wasn't my view. But that's one that they felt, and that was indicated by the information to me about earlier discussions between officials, which most of the discussions were between officials and the trustee and the trust, not to expect an increase.
If we just go back to paragraph 6 of this briefing, at the top of page 2, please. We see set out there that the business case was based on the position that the surviving registrants were living longer, their living costs and needs are therefore substantially different and greater. What part of that did you not think justified an increase in funding?
I don't think it was about not recognising the need and the changing circumstances that the Trust was reflecting and had reflected in an earlier report, I think back in 2002-03, when they'd done another report about the changing needs of both those infected but also their families over time. I think the reality was that there was a limited budget within the department and that could not be met. And again, as I said earlier, the initial work on this began before I started. I'm not completely, I can't recall what exactly was discussed when the department agreed with Mcfarland they would do this business case. And certainly in looking through the documents, the fact that it came in at the end of the year didn't leave, for example, a lot of time to discuss in detail about what those needs were and how they might be managed. And that's something I've reflected on. I reflected on at the time. There are areas of the documents that indicate that I've raised that as an issue, and I've reflected on it since in preparing for today.
Just before we leave this briefing, the conclusion said the officials felt that the justification for an increase is not strong. Was that a view you shared?
In terms of the business case that came in and the amount of areas it was covering, I wouldn't say it wasn't justified, but I would say that probably an earlier discussion about what was coming through would have been helpful much earlier, and that didn't happen, even though officials were obviously in touch with the trust and the trust with officials. When it came in, it wasn't that I was surprised about some of the issues as I read through the business case, but it was a real step change in terms of what was expected, that more time earlier than when we got it, either in November or in the new year, might have been helpful.
The question, I think, was, did you share the view that there was the justification was not strong? I'm not sure you've answered that.
I'm not sure if justification is the right sort of word, Sir Brian, to be honest, because there was obviously the business case was very detailed, gave very practical examples of the sort of issues that people were dealing with and living with, the difficulties that there were, not only in terms of the Department of Health, but also other departments of the government who also had some responsibilities in terms of support as well. I think in terms of when it came in and where we were in terms of the pressure on departmental budgets, this sort of detail, this complexity and the sums involved were difficult to resolve. I didn't think it was justified to say there should be no increase, which is the recommendation that was the number one recommendation from officials.
Can we turn then to DHSC 0041159_237, please? It's a handwritten note from Jackie Buchan. It's a little bit tricky to read, but I think the part that's in your handwriting, it says this. It's asking for a decision in relation to the funding. Well, it doesn't look like we can pay more, and why can't the costs of running the trust be reduced to provide more money? Run this past Norman and Liz for urgent observations. I think that's what your writing says to start with.
Yes, it does.
Would it might suggest from this that essentially the officials had already made the decision and you were really in a position where all you could do was rubber stamp it?
I think it indicates that I was trying to see if there was any more money. I mean, the advice I got back showed that actually the trust did not have money that could be put into the pot for supporting individuals. But I think it shows that I was actually trying to say, is there any more money from anywhere else we can get to increase the offer?
Did you feel that this was a decision you were taking, or that it was a decision that had already effectively been taken by officials?
No, I think it was a decision I was making because the recommended decision by officials was not to have an increase at all. And I wanted options that provided some extra money, even though it was nowhere at the end of the day near what people were asking for. So ultimately I did make that decision. But I was...
Go for it.
But the options open to me and the availability of resources was limited, and that I didn't have much control over.
There was then a further briefing on the 7th of July, which we won't go to, but for the transcript, the reference is DHSC 5156234. And in your statement, you also refer to an oral briefing meeting on the 11th of July 2006. Do you recall why you had both a further written brief and an oral briefing meeting before you then met with Mr. Stevens and registrants of the Trust on the 12th of July?
I mean, usually if I wanted an oral briefing as well, it's because I just wanted to test some of the things I was being told in the briefing. and to explore more and to understand more about the context of, how we got to this point and the situation. I can't recall in detail, but that would have been, and any new information that had come to light. But it was a chance to ask further questions and clarify points that were in the briefing or points that weren't in the briefing that I was unsure about.
You had the meeting on the 12th of July 2006, and you've addressed in your statement some of the notes of the meeting that criticise you and say you were taken by surprise, or seemed to be taken by surprise, by some of the things at the meeting. Were you taken by surprise?
No. Not in the sense that I, obviously realised that what the Trust was asking for was not going to be possible. Not only the Trust but others had put in a lot of work and insight into producing the business case, and that it was going to be a meeting in which that would be expressed and shared. So I wasn't surprised at that. I went into that meeting knowing that I wasn't going to be able to say yes to what was being asked, and therefore that was in the back of my mind. But I still wanted to be able to listen to what people had to say, everybody in the room, ask some questions, try and find out more. I think it was the first meeting with a minister since 2003. If not to affect any change in terms of what I was going to be able to offer, at least to be able to think about, what might happen next and going forward.
And was that the first time you had met and engaged with people who had been infected or affected?
I think directly, yes. There may have been people at some other parliamentary events that I attended with all party groups. Obviously, parliamentarians would write in about their constituents as well. And obviously, I read the briefings, but yeah, that had an informed voice from those people as well. But yes, and I did want to make sure that they were present at the meeting.
You then briefed the Secretary of State, and there were email discussions between officials which you weren't copied into. But we then come to the letter that you wrote to Mr Stevens on the 28th of July 2006, HSOC 305411. We see the third paragraph. I've considered carefully all the points that were made at our meeting. I've also looked at the wider picture, including trends in numbers of registrants and the level of benefits available from the Trust's funds. I am satisfied that an increase of £400,000, approximately 11%, to the Trust's funding will maintain an appropriate level of support to their remaining registrants and is within the current level of government funding that is available. This will bring the funding of each year to £3.754 million for the Mcfarland Trust and £177,000 for the Eileen Trust, assuming a 90-10 split on the current ratio of their size. Both these figures include provision for administration costs. In Mr Stevens' evidence, he's indicated that in fact this was not an 11% rise because previously there was a Section 64 grant which was now wrapped up, and there was no account taken for the increase in running costs that the Trust anticipated. What would your response to that be?
I don't think the letter is probably as clear as it might have been looking at it and being reminded of it. And certainly afterwards there was clarification required. The running costs for the Mcfarland Trust had used to be a Section 64 grant. It was taken out of that, but there was, I think, a guarantee to make sure it was still provided for from other sources. So that wasn't in itself included in the 400,000. And I think that is clear from what the budget finally ended up to be. The 11%, again, I mean, part of that was linked to earlier submissions, I think, that inform me this was written by an official. They would have done the figures and presented it to me. Normally, as a minister, you wouldn't necessarily feel you had to second guess that. You would hope the officials would be informed by that. Earlier documents indicated the increase of 400,000 would be about 10%, but clearly it wasn't as clear a letter as it should be, and there was a follow-up meeting, I think, with officials to clarify further. It was also wrong about the Eileen Trust, because the Eileen Trust was still going to get the Section 64 grant for their running costs, so that was wrong in the letter and had to be rectified.
In the middle of the paragraph, we see you saying that you are satisfied that the increase will maintain an appropriate level of support to their remaining registrants. Did you consider that was accurate at the time?
I think probably the word appropriate isn't the right word to use in the context of this.
What word should have been used?
I think it probably would have been provides an increase of funding to support.
I want to move then to the Skipton Fund. At the start of your time in your role, obviously the Skipton Fund excluded widows and dependents. And if we pick up the document DHSC 304213_083, and we see in the paragraphs 2 and 3, it's a letter dealing with correspondence with Nick Harvey MP in relation to a constituent. Mrs X expresses disappointment that the ex gratia financial assistance scheme has not been extended to dependents of those who have died following inadvertent infection from hepatitis C. This was not an easy decision to make, but I think it's important to stress that the underlying principle of the payments is that they should be targeted to help alleviate the suffering of people living with the virus. The payments are not designed to compensate for bereavement, although I fully appreciate the hardship and pain experienced by families who cared for loved ones who have died. I realise that this is little consolation. I do hope that Mrs X can understand the reasons for introducing the ex gratia scheme within a healthcare budget which is limited. This letter it is from June 2005. At this point in time, what were your views of the line being given?
This was a relatively new policy. The Skipton Fund had been policy decision had been decided before I was a minister in the department. It was obviously a UK-wide policy involving the devolved administrations who'd all signed up to or signing up to an agreement on it. And also, from what I understand, was based on budget issues as well. So, in that sense, I was a new minister in the department. This was a relatively new policy, and therefore was, not likely to change because of the circumstances I've just described.
Did you, at this point, question this policy at all, particularly in relation to the difference between the Skipton Fund and the Mcfarland Trust?
I think there probably would have been questions from me about why there were differences, and because obviously these schemes did all have differences within them, and I would have had explanations from officials about why that was the case, and that the Skipton Fund was set up to directly support those who were living with the infection rather than support for anyone else who was affected by it, and the rationale for why that was done probably was explained to me, including in terms of probably cost.
Other than cost, do you recall what else you were told about the rationale?
That only it was set up and the parameters, and that was agreed on a UK-wide basis, and there was agreement on it that it should only be for those who were living with the infection.
That's not really a rationale for setting it up in that way, is it?
I mean, I wasn't party to the establishment of it, Sir Brian, and the context at the time. But I was a new minister in the department, and it was an established policy. And some of the things that I was dealing with, for example, were related to the appeals panel and so on. So again, it was a policy that I'd inherited, in which my scope for changing something that had gone through, not just England, Scotland, but Wales, and I think Northern Ireland, wasn't really there. It was as I say, I wasn't party to the original discussions.
On the in the June of 2005, changes to the scheme were being considered by the Scottish Executive. And if we can pick up a letter from Andy Kerr to Patricia Hewitt, DHSC 000 6 888 _044, please. And it reads as follows: as you are aware, the Health Committee of the Scottish Parliament amended Section 24 of the Smoking Health and Social Care Scotland Bill, which relates to the Skipton Fund, to extend eligibility to claim payments to the relatives and dependents of patients who contracted hepatitis C through NHS treatment but have now died. I'm keen to ensure that we continue as far as possible with a clear and agreed UK approach to making ex gratia payments, as reflected in the existing UK Skipton scheme. We're concerned about the precedent with regard to calls for compensation, aware that we have an agreement with other UK administrations and with DWP, although we're all subject to the democratic process, and aware too of creating further calls on health budgets. I have, however, to consider the parliamentary position at stage 3 and the prospects of persuading the Parliament to reverse the amendments which have been made to the bill. These provide for those who died prior to 29th of August 2003 to be eligible for payments, and to allow relatives and dependents to make claims on behalf of those who died after the 5th of July 2004, whether or not they had applied to Skipton before they died. My judgment is that the Parliament may agree not to extend eligibility to those who died before the 29th of August 2003. I believe, however, we may need to show flexibility in relation to applications from relatives and dependents of those who die after the 5th of July 2004, and I propose that we agree to amend the Skipton Fund scheme to remove the requirement that claims need to be made before the date of death. And then in handwriting we see resist any change. Can you help us, first of all, with whose handwriting that is, and whether it's yours?
It's not mine. I think it's Patricia Hewitt's.
You were made aware of the issues, if not the correspondence, for the transcript. That can be found in DHSC 6263763. But if we just look, first of all, at that middle paragraph, I'm keen to ensure that there would be a clear and agreed UK approach, and there was concerns about a precedent. Did you share his concerns, Andy Kerr's concerns that are expressed here?
Definitely about having a UK-wide approach, yes. It would, yeah.
Why was that so important?
But I think, in terms of having, for all those that, affected by the decisions around the scheme, parity across the UK made sense.
If parity across the UK was important, was there any reason why that parity couldn't be of greater provision? No, in the sense of no. If there was a decision made that it should all be the same, then obviously that could include discussion about changes to the scheme. So parity per se wasn't a reason not to extend the scheme. It was simply a reason for Scotland not to go it alone. Would that be fair?
I think at the point that I was informed about what was happening in Scotland, the Scottish ministers were also in the same position as the policy of our department, which was to stick to what we'd already agreed and not make any further changes. Obviously, as things progressed, that view changed.
You were then briefed on the issues on the 18th of August 2005, and we'll pick up your response to that. DHSC 0004193 _ 011. It's an email from Anna Norris, who I think you think is from your private office.
That's correct.
PSPH was not content for the advice and draft reply to be forwarded on to Secretary of State. The key concern is that the only grounds given for changing policy on the Skipton Fund is that Scotland have changed their policy. PSPH is absolutely clear that if we change the eligibility for this scheme, it should be on the basis of policy considerations rather than being pushed by Scotland. Why were you so adamant about that point?
Because I think, coming into the department, I'd been briefed on various schemes, including the Skipton Fund. Obviously, as you can see from this note, I had done an adjournment debate on this issue where I'd been advised and given the obviously the policy position on who was eligible and who was not. And I did feel that if there was a discussion to be had about eligibility, then we should try and discuss that in the round, rather than what then was happening it was basically, lobbying and changes in Scotland where suddenly the position moved. Now, obviously, that was helpful for families, but I just thought, why aren't we having that conversation and working alongside this together rather than just waiting for a committee in Scotland to do this? Not that Scotland shouldn't be able to do things, but it seemed to me that that was not necessarily, I thought, helpful to discussing the wider policy of eligibility.
We see in the second paragraph, when PSPH was preparing for the adjournment debate on hepatitis C on the 11th of July, the issue of the Scottish amendments was raised. She specifically asked at that stage what the policy issues are around the eligibility criteria. She is not clear, therefore, why this hasn't been addressed. So two things arise from that. Was it an unusual event for something not to have been addressed?
Can I just read it again?
Of course.
Thank you. Which paragraph?
When PSPH was preparing.
Oh, right, yeah. I think when I had the adjournment, from memory, I'm just trying to recall this. I think probably when I had the adjournment debate and MPs had raised issues, that it opened up more questions that at that point I didn't feel I had the answers to. And therefore, it wouldn't be unusual for me, to be honest, as a minister, to then come away from that and say, can I have some more information about the eligibility issues? Why are we doing this? Why are we doing that? Again, this was, I think, a few months of me coming into the department. So obviously I was trying to learn more about some of these policies that had already been agreed and what the parameters are and how they work.
But was it unusual for you to have requested something on the 7th of July and for you to be now at the 19th of August and those points not to have been addressed?
Yes, and I think that's covered in some of the notes, that I hadn't had a response to that.
It might be suggested that the sense one gets from this email, and in fact your evidence a moment ago, that you felt wrong-footed by the Scottish amendments and the way it was handled. Would that be fair?
I don't think I was kept as aware as I should have been, I think, about the changing situation.
Could we then pick up a document from September, DHSC 0041162 _ 092 and 093, and if we can have them side by side, that would be very helpful. We have a note to you from Daniel dated the 27th of September, responses from officials on the Skipton Fund. From the responses, the argument verges on the circular. A scheme operating differently in England to Scotland is legally sound if there is a clear policy reason for operating two separate schemes, yet there's no clear policy reason for the Scottish system. And then I think it's your handwriting.
Yes.
Yes, I understand this. What concerns me is the fact that since being in post, the Scottish system has been well known.
That situation.
Scottish situation has been well known, but no advice to follow Scots, e.g. was forthcoming till August. What info was new that led to...
Recommended policy. Sorry.
No, it's fine. The process is what concerns me. If info gathering letter is to be sent to Andy Kerr only with changes, but wait till meeting with officials. First of all, is that an accurate rendering of what's written, roughly?
Yes.
Can you explain what your concerns about process were?
I think not being kept up to speed. Essentially, a lot of the work around the Skipton Fund was being handled, obviously, at an official level, not just in DH, but obviously with officials in other administrations, devolved administrations, which is completely understandable. That happens all the time across government. But I think in terms of, one was just being felt that I wasn't kept up to speed about the changes, but also that we would move our position, or the recommendation to move our position. And I think in that context, having been, as a minister, obviously in adjournment debates and other activities, stating the policy as it stood about eligibility, I think I felt there could have been a discussion for us to have to say, well, look, if this isn't happening, what should we be doing on this? And possibly that we could have moved forward together earlier, rather than necessarily waiting to be seen as just responding to what had happened in a committee in Scotland. And yeah, that was the situation, I think, for me.
And do you have any sense of why officials didn't move this earlier? Why this wasn't done sooner?
I presume because they thought maybe that the situation in Scotland wouldn't materialise to create any push for change.
Could we then turn to DHSC 5152685, please? So a minute from William Conan to you and the Secretary of State. We see the issue is recorded. Secretary of State is being asked by Andy Kerr if she'll make changes in England to the provisions of the Skipton Fund, the making of ex gratia payments to patients infected with hepatitis C as a result of the transfusion of blood or blood products, in line with a recent amendment in the Smoking Health and Social Care Scotland Act 2005. Then if we turn the page, we have the heading discussion. And it's the third bullet point that I want to pick up. In England, the cost of any such payments would have been included in the original estimates for the overall cost of the scheme. When you were dealing with this matter, were you aware that that was the position?
I don't believe I was.
It might be suggested that given the payments had been included in the original estimates, it should have been provided to widows and dependents from the beginning. What would you say to that?
Clearly from seeing this, and at that time, that is obviously an option that was open because the money was there, or it would appear from this submission.
So I'm about to move away from the Alliance House organisations, and I notice the time. I wonder whether it's worth today taking a break just 5 minutes earlier before I move on.
Yes, well, we'll do that. and we shall come back at 11:45, so 11:45 we return. Now, this is the first break in your evidence. What I say to all witnesses is that they're giving evidence under oath, and they must not, you must not, discuss the evidence you have given, or for that matter, anything you think you may yet be asked about in evidence, with anyone, whoever that anyone is. But you're free to talk about anything else you like.
Thank you.
11:45.